From the campus of the University of Kentucky, you're listening to Behind the Blue. I'm Cody Kaiser with UK Strategic Communications.
You really do come in with this just knowledge that this is going to be the big rivalry game for us. And you get yourself to believe it. I mean, whether or not you feel like it should or should not be a rivalry, I mean, because of the pressure that is put on it, because of the media attention that is put on it, because of how much it means to the community, it becomes a part of the fabric of who you are. And I think a lot of it does hinge on this idea of identity, that my identity is oftentimes tied to this sport, it's tied to this team, and it's tied to the success that we have as either individuals or as a collective group. And when things go counter to that identity, it has a tendency to cause us to react in ways that don't always allow for the best of ourselves to be put out for public consumption.
That's Matt Moore, Associate Professor in the UK College of Social Work. Sports rivalries are a cornerstone of athletic culture, sparking packed bleachers, passionate debates, and unforgettable moments. But what drives the fervor that fans feel for their team and the disdain they have for their rivals? Experts suggest the answer lies not just in the scoreboard, but in the human psyche. On this episode of Behind the Blue, Moore is joined by Tarkington Newman, the director of the College of Social Work's Sports Social Work Research Lab, to discuss how rivalries are more than competition. They're a powerful blend of identity, emotion, and instinct. They explore the psychology behind sports rivalries, why we love our teams as fiercely as we loathe the opposition, why this drama keeps us coming back for more, as well as the dark side of letting rivalries become too much of our identities. Matt Moore and Tarkington Newman, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today on Behind the Blue. I briefly want to let each of you introduce yourselves and kind of talk about the work that each of you specifically do in the College of Social Work, and I'll let either of you start with that. So Tarkington has gotten the baton handed over. So
perfect. My research encompasses youth development, primarily through sport and recreation. And so ultimately, I look at how programs can be developed, how coaches can be intentional with their practices to promote healthy youth development, primarily life skills, and more recently, mental health literacy.
So Matt Moore, Associate Dean for the College of Social Work, and thanks so much for having Dr. Newman and I with you on the podcast today. So my area of sports social work research really hinges upon the collegiate athlete space. So I'm coming to this particular podcast and to this role here at UK also with 18 years of college coaching experience behind my belt as well too. So I've been a part on the coaching side and as a student athlete on the rivalry perspectives quite a bit, but I do a lot of research in the areas of student athlete mental and behavioral health and policy implementations that sport organizations can put into place to ensure healthy and safe environments for athletes to compete and for them to grow as individuals.
So we're talking today about kind of the umbrella of this is a conversation about the psychology of sports rivalries. And when I pitched this, I wasn't even sure if that was going to be like, I thought maybe we'll get in here and maybe you guys will like say, well, you know, what we're doing is what we're looking at is kind of similar to that or whatever. But I guess in a kind of a big picture, just jumping into it, what drew each of you to study the psychology of sports and kind of branching out into rivalry type study? But what brought you into that just in general?
I mean, so for me, I was extremely blessed to be able to compete at the collegiate level. Tennis is my sport. I went straight in from collegiate playing experience right into coaching right away. Coaching has been a part of my life and a part of my identity as I've worked my way through educational settings. I still coach actively to this day. So, you know, for me, it's that lived experience that I've had both as a student athlete and as a coach, and then being able to take that step back from an academic lens and from a social work practitioner lens to be able to see the impact that competition and that high-level athletics has not only from a competitive perspective, but also the impact that it has on the lived experiences of athletes as it relates to their own mental health, their behavioral health, the relationships they have with their team, the impact that rivalries and events like that can have on community-based settings. So just, thinking about it from that sort of ecological, holistic mindset.
Yeah, and I would just add, really similar to Matt, a lot of it stems from my experience as an athlete and as a coach. And so just a little bit about kind of my coaching background is I've been coaching for 15 or 16 years now, at different levels, from middle school to high school to collegiate to private clubs. And I think my experience both in coaching and as an athlete, sport can be used as a positive tool or a really positive platform, but you can also have a lot of really negative experiences in sport. And so kind of my goal as a researcher is to figure out what are those positive experiences, and then how can we maximize them to really promote healthy development and just fun in sport.
I want to branch off briefly and talk about the Sports Social Work Research Lab. Give me a little bit of background on that and kind of how it got its start and what the goals of the lab might be.
Yeah, so the Sport Social Work Research Lab is really just dedicated to studying different components of sport. Again, kind of similar to my experience coaching, it can span anywhere from community-based youth development programs, high school sport to collegiate athletics. But ultimately, the lab is just really committed to trying to figure out how can we maximize sport, and how can we promote healthy experiences, healthy development, kind of like Matt said, also healthy relationships, and the ability to, in essence, teach skills, teach life lessons through sport. And so within the lab, I work with a lot of different students, obviously within the College of Social Work, but also kind of throughout the university and other programs, and really lean on them to understand what's going on and kind of like what are the pertinent and pressing issues for athletes today. In relation to like the student research, I like working with a lot of different students from a lot of different programs because they bring in really unique perspectives. And that's one thing in the research community that we're trying to do, is understand interdisciplinary work and interprofessional collaborations. And so the ability to work with students kind of across the campus really lends a critical perspective in understanding just sport experiences, whether that's from a social and emotional component within social work, or a psychological component for psychology, or more even like a macro looking at sports sociology. But ultimately, it's the lab is really kind of just a place for exploration to understand what sports are and what they can be. And then again, just giving students the opportunity to really engage and lead research experiences.
I appreciate the fact that you mentioned studying like the positive and negative aspects of sports involvement, because oftentimes I don't know that we necessarily think about those different types of categories and how involvement in sports can build character and leadership skills and things like that, but also there are some negative aspects of it. And it brings me to this idea of talking about rivalries, and definitely there can be some positive and negative aspects to that. I guess in a sense, from a basic sense, what defines a rivalry game? What makes it feel different for players and fans compared to just kind of a regular game?
I love this question. So, when I think about rivalries, I think everything within that rivalry is approached differently. I think about the work that athletic trainers are doing, right? You approach a rivalry game from a different mindset, from an athletic training perspective. You approach it differently from a coaching perspective, from a sports psychology or sports social work lens. You're going to approach it differently. This is the game, right? It's a game that you get yourself hyped up for throughout the duration of the season, right? There's a reason that rivalry games, for instance, in football happen the very last week of the season, right? You build up to it, so that when that moment comes, you should be as ready and prepared as possible to be able to go out there and to be a combatant in your sport for however long it is that you're going to be out there, to be able to bring home a victory for your team and for your community. And I think that community aspect ties a lot into the rivalry perspective. Just means a lot more from that community setting, right? You hear about it, you know that it's coming. It's a date that you mark on your calendar from the beginning of the season that's been identified. And rivalries also transcend the different types of sports, right? I mean, I'm in a sport of tennis that doesn't necessarily get the media attention. It doesn't always get the spotlight the way in which other sports do, but rivalries mean just as much in a sport like that as they do in some of the large market media sports that we see as well. So there's just something special that really defines it. And there's so many different ways to define it, whether it's, how the individual defines it, how the team defines it, how a athletic department defines it, all the way up to the community level with how the community in which you live defines that rivalry.
It really is kind of at this point, chicken egg kind of a thing, because I don't there's so many rivalries that go so far back. It's like I don't even know how this began, or I don't know what the origins of this are, but it's just always been this way. And so it doesn't matter in a lot of ways who the players are on any particular team or who the coaching staff might be. It's just like pre-baked into the team psyche that this other team is our rival. And I suppose that's different in some ways. Like organizationally, that is something that's like I said, kind of pre-baked in, and the parts are interchangeable. But then you also have rivalries that are among individuals. And you mentioned tennis, professional tennis. I think of so many professional tennis rivalries that like define eras of tennis. When you think about the great matchups over the decades and the names, Sampras and Nadal and the Williams sisters and all of and going way back. And so sometimes it's team based and sometimes it's more personal. How do the across these, like, how do the psychological factors, like, especially for a team thing, like identity and belonging and pride, play into that experience, not just for players, but also for fan bases and communities?
So I'll start, and then obviously, Tark, feel free to add as you see fit. So, at the individual perspective, when we think about rivalries, you come in and obviously that there are going to be teams that you mark on a schedule. There's going to be individual athletes that you're going to compete, that you're going to mark onto a schedule. But how those emerge is always fascinating to me, right? I mean, some of the greatest rivalries that we've seen in sport are ones that you go, well, why would that even necessarily be a rivalry? Some of them have got geographic boundaries, right? University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, same state, two powerhouses, makes sense. Others are always fascinating to see how those emerge and how those come into play from that sort of team psyche perspective. I mean, like you had mentioned, you really do come in with this just knowledge that this is going to be the big rivalry game for us. And you get yourself to believe it. I mean, whether or not you feel like it should or should not be a rivalry, I mean, because of the pressure that is put on it, because of the media attention that is put on it, because of how much it means to the community, it becomes a part of the fabric of who you are. And, for better or for worse, we talk about the pros and the cons of sport participation, right? I mean, we saw just even this past couple of weeks as rivalry games happened across the country in college football and college basketball and some of the other sports that are out there, that it can bring out the best in individuals, and it can absolutely bring out the worst in individuals in the way in which you react and you respond to some of those environments. And I think a lot of it does hinge on this idea of identity, that my identity is oftentimes tied to this sport, it's tied to this team, and it's tied to the success that we have as either individuals or as a collective group. And when things go counter to that identity, it has a tendency to cause us to react in ways that don't always allow for the best of ourselves to be put out for public consumption.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think identity is a really large component of it. But I also think it also goes back to relationships. And so when you trace back rivalry games, whether it's in high school, college, professional, whether it's a rivalry between two players, two coaches, a lot of times it goes back to kind of their relationships with each other. The good relationships, the bad relationships, potentially where there was a split in a relationship. But a lot of why rivalry games kind of take on their own meaning is because not only do they speak to one's identity, but they're going to speak to the relationship to somebody else's, and kind of like what Matt said, is threats to their own identity with that.
I'm thinking about from a team perspective that for something like this to begin, you mentioned geographic proximity to one another, and I think that's definitely obvious with like UK U of L, but I think about things like the University of Kentucky, and people that are listening there's going to be a shudder at the University of Kentucky and Duke, and how in a lot of ways you can pinpoint right back to 1992 and that game in the NCAA tournament as kind of a launching point, because in my childhood, I don't remember anything before that ever was any sort of historical moment or anything that started something off. And I look back at that. So thinking about how sometimes those moments, because you're not close to each other in any other way. And I think about that in the context of like UK and Duke, UK and North Carolina, because of their history and tradition. UK and Wake Forest don't have a rivalry. So there are factors that contribute to this. But how important are shared narratives to this? As far as like, to have a rivalry, the other side has to buy into it as well, correct? So what are some factors there that like you have to have those pieces, right?
You do have to have those pieces, and I'm glad that you brought up the historical aspect, because obviously history and culture plays a factor into the creation of rivalries as well. I mean, when you've got schools or programs, whether it's youth or college or professional, that have had long-standing success in the sports that they compete in, I mean, you're going to naturally have some of those rivalries, right? You talk about Duke in Kentucky, you talk about Kansas in Kentucky, you talk about Indiana University, my alma mater, go Hoosiers, in Kentucky. So, I mean, there's a lot of those different components that factor into that do create rivalries over the course of time and singular moments in history, right? When you're talking about the game in 1992, that triggers a rivalry because of the impact of that game, the emotions that were tied into it, and there's always that we're going to get you the next time because of that. So something that happened long before current athletes at UK or Duke were even alive, right? I mean, we're 15 years before most of the athletes that are competing for these programs now are even alive. It still resonates with them today, which is some of the beauties in sports. It's one of the beauties that exists within rivalries. But it's also, how do you keep something like that going for all of these years, even though athletes now were not even alive, nor were they a part of some of these things that were happening in the 1990s or heck, even early 2000s.
I suppose it goes a long way towards showing that humans have a really solid ability to hold a grudge for a very long time. And I think part of it too, maybe there's something to that idea of familiarity breeds contempt. I think in particular professional football, the divisions, when you play your division mates twice a year, and sometimes I can see where preventing the success of someone else can create that as well, create those conditions. Maybe you're a Cleveland fan or a Pittsburgh fan or a Cincinnati fan, and you might not be having a good season, but you can beat that other team that has a chance to win the division or get a particular seeding in the playoffs, and you might not even be making the postseason, but you've spoiled it, that idea of a spoiler. And so that level of like taking something away from someone else, that familiarity of playing each other repetitively. Pittsburgh and Dallas famously had multiple Super Bowls in the 70s that they played in. they met each other often. So that kind of familiarity. And I think about the cultural and societal factors, specifically when it comes to some of these teams, like regional identity and how much is placed in that. I think the Steelers are a good example of that, just in the name of the team and what they represent. The group of people in Pittsburgh and in the northern part of the Appalachian region, and that type of blue collar. I hang my hat on this. I rise and fall with the success and failures of this team. And here comes this other team from maybe another place that's more affluent, and I have a resentment there. I think that's an interesting kind of play there, that those ideologies and those kind of backgrounds play into it.
Well, to me, that hits sort of at the core of just our social work profession as a whole. So when we think about social work, right, we think about work at the individual level, at the family level, at the team or group level, at the community level, and then even into the broader societal perspective. And you look at all the things that we've talked about so far related to rivalries. Each of those different elements are present within that, right? The individual perspective, the team perspective, the community perspective, and then the larger cultural mindset that exists within that. And I do love what you were talking about around the spoiler idea, right? We saw a lot of that this weekend, right? I mean, a 1-10 Purdue football team playing a 10-1 Indiana football team with hopes of a national championship, or at least a spot in the national tournament. I mean, Purdue would have loved to have won that game. That would have made their entire season. So, I mean, you look at Michigan beating on Ohio State this weekend. Same thing. Knocks Ohio State out of a Big Ten championship. Syracuse and Miami, though I'm not convinced that's necessarily a rivalry, but you watch Syracuse beat Miami, knock Miami out of an ACC championship, likely knock them out of an opportunity for a college football playoff bid. So, I mean, there's so many factors that go into it that no matter what your season has looked like up to that point, this is an opportunity for you to do something special and to sort of renew that faith and that spirit within your fan base.
When we talk about this from the positives and the negatives, the aspect of it on the players and the communities and things like that, are there ways that rivalries bring communities together outside of the sport? I mean, how does that move outside of the boundaries of the playing field into more of a community kind of aspect?
I think really long-seated rivalries, especially when you're thinking different, especially like regionally and community-based rivalries, oftentimes you can kind of figure out and meet in the middle around like a common cause. And so kind of like Matt was just talking about with Ohio State and Michigan, I'm an alum from both of those programs, interestingly. Go Blue. But one of the things that they have done, and it's been with the universities at large, and then even some of the individual sport teams, all the way down to the student organizations, is within that rivalry, they do like a blood drive donation. And ultimately both schools, both everybody from each school, it offers another opportunity to kind of buy into that rivalry and compete in that rivalry in and of yourself, as aside to just kind of supporting the players and the teams that are involved in that. But it gives folks from the community the opportunity to actually engage in it themselves.
I think about things that we do during particular times of the year. For example, the blood drive that we do during Tennessee Week, and we have a competing blood drive, which is its own kind of, bragging rights kind of thing. But it is one of those things that kind of transcends the sport and moves into a place of like, let's do something that's positive for the community. And so let's create a blood drive that we can kind of tie into this. And I think that's an interesting kind of take on things.
It is. The sport is one of the few things in this world that I actually think can unite mass groups of individuals. It's a common language that a lot of individuals speak. I mean, you see a lot in sort of the sport for development realm also around how sport can be a driving force in communities that have been adversely impacted by a variety of different things, right? Whether it's natural disaster related, political strife that exists in some of the different places around the world. I mean, sport is one thing that oftentimes can transcend boundaries and borders and all the other things that exist out there in the world that divide us, right? And there's plenty of things that are divisive to us. And rivalries are divisive in many ways, right? I mean, we are rooting for one team or the other, but for that couple hour block of time, like we're focused. We're focused in on that. We let the things of the outside world escape us, and we dial our attention and our focus into this sport, which can be really therapeutic for a lot of individuals, despite the outcomes of it, right? I mean, obviously our emotions and our feelings get hurt if our team doesn't win, but if we take the bigger picture of it, for those moments, the rest of the world dissolves around us. The challenges that we are facing are no longer prevalent for that couple of hour window, and our mind is reset and focused in on sport, which is really a beautiful thing when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think to what Matt was talking about, it's sports so powerful because it has a shared language. You can go to another country, not speak the language, but if there's a soccer ball laying there on the ground, you both kind of know what to do with it. And so again, it just gives opportunities to what Matt was saying to really engage with each other around kind of this shared experience. And oftentimes, I think, again, to that, we associate sport with even like our youth because so many people have had the opportunity to participate in different forms of sport, recreation, physical activity. And so it, again, just provides a really common language for everyone to really just fully engage in.
I do find that fascinating that it's such a scalable thing from from youth sports, high school sports, up through college, up through the professional levels, but even on a national level. We talk about the Olympics, or we could talk about the World Cup and how nations, square off against each other and have intense rivalries with each other, specifically in the world of soccer. And, there are a lot of sports that are like that. Cricket is another one that there are intense rivalries in. So I think that's kind of fascinating how you can scale up and down based on kind of what population groups you're looking at, and the stakes morph along with that in a sense. From the perspective for athletes and even for just the fan bases in general, what kind of implications are there for mental health and social dynamics? And I guess in a healthy versus unhealthy way, like markers that you should kind of look for to kind of make sure that you're approaching this in a healthy way. But what are some implications, among athletes and then also fans in general?
I mean, undoubtedly, we see, risks for depression, anxiety, mood disorder, anger management, anger control. I mean, the list is endless in a lot of these settings. I think there's an ownership that needs to be placed back on the athletic organizations on how to help athletes to be able to process what it is that they are going through. We put so much emphasis on some of these particular rivalry games or matches that we don't always think on the back end, if it doesn't go our way, right? How are we going to respond in a way that represents the emblem that we wear on our chest, that represents the community in which we are competing for? It's hard for us to think about it, but at the end of the day, it really is a game still. And sometimes we let those rivalries cross over to where a game no longer becomes a game, and it becomes too much of our identity. It becomes too much of our relationships. It becomes too much of an emphasis for us. And we've got a lot of young minds that are out there, underdeveloped minds in the youth sports setting. As we get into the college world, individuals that are navigating a bunch of different dual identities, that sometimes it's unfair, the expectations that we place on other individuals without providing them the support that they need to be able to process what happens if we lose a rivalry game, or if we win a rivalry game. How do we do it in a way that also represents the best of our organization? Maybe not planting flags in the middle of football fields or trying to incite different things that go on out there in the world around us. So just a lot of education that needs to happen in that space, and awareness of just the multitude of pressures that surround the rivalry environment, from not only the competitive side, but from a social work mind, right? The more important side of it is that life implications that we can learn from these types of events.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it's sport, particularly rivalries, are really great opportunities for learning. I think it's learning about yourself, learning about how you deal with winning, how you deal with losing, how you can kind of come back and demonstrate resiliency, what have you.
Kind of looking ahead at the future of rivalries in a sense. We're in such a different world than we've ever been in as far as realignments of conferences, NIL deals, players that have a lot more control and ownership of their particular athletic career path. How do you see those types of things changing the nature of traditional rivalries over time? And might we get to a place where a lot of these fade away and we develop new ones? I don't imagine that we're ever going to get rid of the concept of a rivalry. So do they change kind of the nature of the teams? Or
Yes, I don't know if human behavior would allow for us to change it. I mean, that's one thing that you're fighting in rivalries is that human behavior and that human instinct. I mean, I absolutely think the landscape of sport is going to change, obviously with NIL being a factor, the transfer portal and the college game being a factor, obviously the desire for a lot of athletes to think about professional involvement and the growth of professional sport leagues, even in sports that used to not have professional playing opportunities that now do. So, I mean, there will certainly be changes to it, but when you're fighting against human behavior, it's hard to change human behavior, especially human behavior that has been ingrained in us for decade upon decade as it relates to many of these rivalries. I mean, I don't see a world in which a UK and a U of L don't have some form of a rivalry. Could it ebb and flow in the level of the rivalry? Sure, but it is always going to be there. And I think some of it is not so much driven by individual athletes or by coaches or by teams, but that's where that community aspect comes into play, right? I mean, the community is massive when you think about the involvement as it relates to rivalries. And I can't see Lexington ever looking at the Louisville neighbor and going, oh yeah, let's be really peaceful and cordial and kind when we participate in these athletic events with each other. So while the players might ebb and flow and the coaches might ebb and flow, the roots within the community and the human behavior, I don't think will change.
Yeah, I think it's for athletes and coaches, even if you weren't born into that rivalry, it's an opportunity to really gear up for competition. And so like, even though an athlete may have nothing, no historical background with a certain university, ultimately athletes, coaches are always looking kind of for that competitive edge. And it's just another mechanism. It's another way to kind of dig a little bit deeper and figure out exactly what you have and what you're able to kind of do on that field.
And therein lies a great double-edged sword, though, too, I think, right? When you've got the pressure that you put on a rivalry game, right? How do your athletes respond to it? How do you mentally get them to prepare for it? How do you physically get them to prepare for it? So there's a lot that goes into that from the coaching perspective and from the athlete development perspective as well, when you're trying to ensure that not only are we ready for this rivalry, but we're ready for it on all fronts. So yes, it's a great motivator, but it's only a great motivator if we do all the other things on the back end to truly prepare you for what does it mean to be a participant in a rivalry competition.
As people think about this, listen to it, maybe have conversations with other people about it, what would you like fans to maybe understand about the psychology of rivalries that they might not already know? It's something that maybe they don't even know about their own behavior or their own perceptions of it. What is something that you might think that people should take away?
Spectators are brutal. I mean, they really are just brutal. So, I mean, like the words, the thoughts, the actions, the things that go into what we see from community members, and this is true from youth sport all the way up to the highest level of competition. Athletes and coaches and support staff, they feel it. I mean, they feel it really, really deeply. I mean, there's a lot of individuals out there that are coaching for their jobs. There's athletes that are out there playing for the opportunity to advance their athletic career. They don't necessarily need the negative comments from the other individuals that are out there. I mean, they're intrinsically motivated. Extrinsic statements and comments from others can be really detrimental to the health and the well-being of other individuals. There's a lot of great research out there on the role that spectator behavior plays in the overall health and well-being of athletes, and it's really scary. I mean, it's scary to think that athletes and coaches and others are subjected to the types of things that they do. I mean, I understand as a fan of many teams that we get fired up and we get amped up as spectators and as community members, but we also have to be able to take a step back and realize on the other side or underneath of a helmet or on the other side of a jersey are actual humans, and humans that feel and experience the world in different ways. And while they're blessed and they're gifted with the talents that they have within sport, doesn't mean that they don't battle and they don't struggle with things outside of sport or the way in which sport might impact their overall health and well-being. And that's where it's kind of that village mentality that all of us have to work together to be able to ensure that we're doing what we can to support our athletes and to put the best out there. Athletes that are fearful of how a community is going to react, probably not able to give you the best in competition because their mind is shifted to where they're not always necessarily thinking about each and every second of the play that is getting ready to happen, but they're thinking about the boos that they hear, the negative things that they're hearing from fans in the stands and other things that absolutely impact their ability to be successful.
I think that's important to remember too, in the sense that we've all heard the stories of, for example, like maybe the quarterback that plays 3 or 4 years at a college and never was able to beat the rival team, was never able to get that win. But they went on and had a wildly successful professional career, or they went on to do something, some other profession, and were very successful at it. It wasn't something that was like weighing on them as they moved through their life to have a successful career doing whatever. But I'm sure there's probably still that, in the quiet moments, in the part of their head somewhere, part of their thoughts, they think about that. Probably not something that they want to be reminded about a lot, because as you said, it's just a game.
Yeah, I think it stays with you because it's part of your identity and the narrative of your life, and kind of your life story and those experiences. And because you may build that game or that moment up so much in your life and in your head as this critical moment, those really stick with you and stick with your memory, and ultimately oftentimes kind of shape how you may view other things in the world.
Yeah, no, I can't conceptualize the number of tennis matches I played, and I've coached several hundred tennis matches. I mean, and in those are a lot of great wins and a lot of heartbreaking losses, but there are always in those rivalry ones where you don't forget what happens. I mean, you remember the highs of those matches, you remember the lows of those matches, and they stick with you. I mean, 18 years down the road, I can still remember my first rivalry match and what the outcome of it was. And I can't do that for every single match that I've ever coached or that I've ever played in. So it does absolutely stick with you. I think the key thing as you navigate through that is how do you learn the lessons that are important from that? So it's not a win or a loss that you remember, but instead it's the life lessons that you take away from those wins and losses that make a big difference in how you develop as an athlete or as a coach or as a human, right? That's going into different careers and changing the world outside of sports. And I think that's where we have to be able to put more of an emphasis is on that transformational component of what do you really take away from these experiences that are going to help you as you tackle different challenges, because God knows there's going to be challenge after challenge after challenge in this world. So how can we best prepare you for what some of those are going to be?
Yeah, I think that's why rivalries can be so meaningful for learning, is you're so bought into that rivalry, into that game, into that moment, that they really do serve as critical learning experiences and opportunities that will ultimately typically stick with you for a very long time. Like I can even now remember back to like my last high school football game when we lost to our big rival. And it like ultimately kind of always just sticks with you, in part because it was such a big moment in your life. But then I think what's really fascinating is, and it kind of depends on your relationship with that moment, but you can often kind of leverage that moment in future situations. So for instance, Within just that specific football game, there was just a lot of different factors kind of going on that made it really challenging. But oftentimes, for me, it's thinking back of like, how did the team kind of start to overcome those challenges? And like, yes, we ended up losing, but at the same time, we put forth our best effort, and ultimately, that for me is what sticks. Is those lessons as opposed to getting too caught up in that win and loss.
That's an interesting point too. That idea that even if you were to lose a game in the rivalry, that there are lessons that you can take from that of just how to comport yourself in your life, how to, I guess, in a sense, be the bigger person and, let that shape you as well, because we are shaped not just by our victories, but also by our losses. And I'm sure that there's some sort of chemical element that creates some sort of core memory that is unlocked whenever we're in those games and the pressure situation where it's just burned in a way that other things are not, where we think about, if I hadn't stepped out of bounds at that point, or if I had only made that shot, or if I'd only put a little less energy into that lob, it would have come, inside the line instead of out, or different things like that. But yeah, giving that perspective to be able to face situations, in your professional life or down the road, or even in interpersonal relationships in your life, of learning how to deal with things in a different way based on the lessons that you took from that stuff.
Nah, absolutely. And it's a fine balance, and it's a really hard balance for individuals. I mean, I've coached hundreds, if not thousands, of athletes in my time. And, it's always interesting to watch how each individual athlete responds. And, how do you have to tailor some of your approach and your conversations and your dialogue with each of those athletes individually to ensure that they understand the key takeaway messages, from a rivalry win or from a rivalry loss as it relates to that. And it's special teaching moments. I mean, it's one of those from a perspective of a coach. I love nothing more than that, because it is one of those moments to where you can really, based off of your actions, demonstrate a lot of valuable life components that can lead individuals to navigate challenging moments, to celebrate the positive experiences that they're going to have in their lives in ways that are truly meaningful for them, and will never replace, right, the heartache and the heartbreak that you feel in rivalry losses, or the jubilee that you feel in a big victory, but certainly helps for you to be able to moderate those in ways that are as best as you can moving forward in life.
I want to be mindful of your time. I appreciate the time that we've had to talk about this stuff. I do want to ask if you want to make mention of any, maybe tied into this, any current research or projects or publications that either of you may be working on, either inside this topic of conversation or outside of it, that you think might be important, that you want people to know about, that they can maybe look further into?
I mean, one, I'll just say this, and Tark, you're going to have to hold me to this. It's a great special edition of a journal is to do something on rivalries. I had to go back and look to see whether or not any sport-based journals have done a special issue on rivalries, but my goodness, what great research could exist within that. So Sports Social Work Research Journal would be a good place for us to give consideration to that. We do have a peer-reviewed journal that is out there, the Sports Social Work Research Journal, that does a lot of, interdisciplinary and inter-collaboration research that is done. Obviously, the work that Tark's doing through the lab. I've got a really cool grant project right now with the National Hockey League Foundation and the Chicago Blackhawks Foundation that is looking at positive youth development practices within coaches, within parents, within youth athletes. I think a lot of what you've got to think about in rivalries is they start so young. Like, how can you start helping from the youngest of age to help individuals be able to process and to think through what those games mean and what you take away from those, because they're not going to go away, right? If you have a long, healthy athletic career, whether you go to play in college or you play professionally, I mean, even at the youth level, right, you start at such a young age. How can you make sure that you're maximizing those learning experiences along the way? And, youth sport organizations all have rivals. So, I mean, I've got 3 kids that are involved in youth sports, and they've got rivals. I could tell you who their rivals are and what it looks like at the high school that they go to or at the elementary schools that they go to, right? There's rivals that exist. So I do think there's a lot of space for continued research within that. It's not something that I have dug a lot into, but certainly after this conversation, right? Great conversations always spark new interest. This is be fascinating to see what we could pull together in some of this rivalry narrative.
Yeah, one project I'm really excited about that we just got grant funding for is working with 2 different communities to co-develop youth sport programs. So we are working with a community in Chicago and another community in San Diego, and ultimately what the purpose of the sport programs are going to be is to teach kids, to teach youth healthy life skills. Really specifically, and it can also interestingly relate to rivalries, is emotional regulation. We're talking about mental health literacy, in part not to get overly too attached or too involved in the sport, and how to have healthy relationships with that sport while still obviously engaging and having fun, and really looking at how sport, how the positive experiences, but also how the negative experiences, maybe losing, maybe just not having the outcome that you wanted, can contribute to learning really key life skills, such as emotional regulation. So when you're thinking about rivalries, like, yes, rivalries are, I think, important. I think they can be very good. But at the same time, there has to be a healthy balance and a healthy relationship with that rivalry. And a lot of that is going to go into emotional regulation and how you exhibit behavior associated with that rivalry.
That is interesting in the idea of talking about emotional regulation with kids and finding an outlet like sports to channel their energy into, to help them maintain focus. I mean, we have so many kids. I always hear more and more about kids who are, talking to counselors, that are in therapy, that are working through things. And I don't know if it's something that has always been needed and we're just now paying more attention to it, or if we've suddenly had a boom in this. But it does seem that, like, having sports as an outlet and that structure, coaches, people who are there to assist, to help provide some rigidity and structure in a kid's life, I could see where that definitely pays huge dividends down the road for emotional development and social development, all those types of things.
It does pay huge dividends, and Dr. Newman's one of the leaders really internationally as it relates to positive youth development within sports. I mean, the work that University of Michigan, Ohio State has done in this space, talking about his dual allegiance to these programs, is truly phenomenal. I would say the other aspect to that is youth are one part of the equation, right? The other part of the equation is how do you best train parents? How do you best train coaches, sport administrators for understanding the importance of the life skills that they're instilling? And I don't think that goes away with the youth sport. All right. I think that extends into collegiate playing. I think it extends into even professional athletics, right? If we have individuals that are well regulated, if we have individuals that have firm perspectives on life, that they're able to understand that their identity is not just wrapped up into this sport world, but instead it extends into multiple things, you're always going to have athletes that are able to contribute greater to their team. They're going to be able to maximize their potential, and ultimately in those rivalry games, they're going to be able to put their best foot forward to be able to help the team come out with the victory.
Excellent. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time. We've had a great conversation. I appreciate the time that we've had. Tarkington Newman and Matt Moore, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. I just want to say thanks for your insight, and good luck with the work that you're continuing to do. If you are listening and you would like to find out more about the work that the University of Kentucky College of Social Work is doing, you can visit the website at socialwork.uky.edu. And again, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Blue. Behind the Blue is a joint production of the University of Kentucky and UK Healthcare. For more stories about UK and UK healthcare, visit uknow.uky.edu.